Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss an article in the Telegraph which is really interesting on multiple levels. On the face of it, it's claiming that Labour cannot pursue its policy of applying VAT to private school fees. It is, of course, quite wrong. But the article in this particular campaign, which has run through outlets like the Telegraph for quite a long time, they're really not letting it go, lets you know just how little consistency these people have, as those who've campaigned as hard as anyone for us to drop our commitments to the European Convention on Human Rights now think it might help them save a few quid on the fees for their child abuse centres. Sorry, I mean private schools. So let's go over the Telegraph's main argument first before we go over what experts have said, because apart from the general amusement I'm getting from this, it's a really good way of understanding how the European Court of Human Rights even works. Because the government and their client journalists have been telling us that the European Court of Human Rights is overriding the will of Parliament over the Rwanda plan. It is, of course, a nonsense. But this is why they're arguing we should leave, or at the very least ignore it. So the first thing I should say about this article is the Telegraph is clearly working on the basis that the incoming Labour government are decent and honourable. After all, if they back Rishi Sunak to simply ignore the court's rulings, why wouldn't Starmer just do the same? And could the Telegraph really complain if Starmer chose to ignore the court ruling when they've been loudly backing the idea of Sunak doing exactly the same for a different policy? But it's better than that. Let us for one moment imagine that a private school or a lobby group representing private schools took the Labour government to court over this. They go through the system, right to the European Court of Human Rights, and argue, as it notes in the article, that the policy is illegal because it breaches people's rights to education on the basis that other educational services would remain VAT-free. And let's just take leave of our senses for a moment and imagine that the justices of the court would agree. So they decide the policy does indeed breach the European Convention on Human Rights. What happens next? Well, I've seen a number of experts in the field comment, but Dan Needle, as always, provides the most comprehensive explanation. And the first point he makes is the court can override ministers and public officials because it exists to counter executive abuses, doesn't override acts of parliament. And this isn't hypothetical. The court has existed, of course, for many decades, and there's a lot of case law in effect. If the court was in the habit of saying to countries or their national legislatures, no, you can't do that tax policy, we'd have some evidence of it. Doesn't exist, apparently. If the court believes that something is a breach of the convention, related to anything at all, the procedure is to request that the parliament in question changes the law to bring themselves back in line with the convention. But they can't force it. So even if the court agreed with the argument, which they wouldn't, all they could do is suggest that Westminster change the law back, and then MPs could go, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, we're not going to do that. Needle cites a case. Of course he does, where exactly this happened. Actually, interestingly, I remember this one. When it happened, it was back in the days of David Cameron, and a prisoner had said that he was being denied his right to vote. It was a breach of his human rights, the fact he wasn't allowed to vote. The court agreed that this actually violated his rights to free elections, because in the UK, convicted prisoners are barred from voting. So the court agreed with the plaintiff unanimously that having his rights to vote taken away just because he was a convicted prisoner was a breach of human rights. So the prisoner won the case. Did they get to vote in the following election? No, because Parliament simply took note of the judgment and said, yeah, we don't agree with that. I remember it was in the news at the time. The point Needle and other legal experts have been making is the way the court operates, it works on the basis of national legislatures being sovereign. It's funny that, isn't it? Governments, yes, they can be overruled, executive abuse, but not parliaments. They decide the laws. They are sovereign. Our own Supreme Court stated in 2019, when Boris Johnson illegally prorogued Parliament, that it is Parliament that is sovereign in this country, not the government. Needle further goes on to explain that nobody has ever been able to use the European Court of Human Rights to successfully challenge UK tax policy. And he says he can't think of a case where it's ever been, where that's ever happened. And he's an experienced tax lawyer. But they have done it. People have tried to use the European Court of Human Rights, and it has just never worked. So let's imagine the Telegraph are right in their unwritten but crucial assertion that Keir Starmer is a thoroughly decent man who, even if he could get Parliament to ignore the courts, wouldn't do so because that would be terribly naughty. So let us imagine that the Telegraph's real plan here works on the basis that Starmer has committed to obeying international laws, which he has, and means it. So if they can get the court to agree with their arguments, Starmer will be honour bound to get his MPs to change the law and remove VAT from private school fees once more. But for that to work, they'd have to persuade those judges that paying VAT for private school fees is indeed a breach of the convention on the basis that it breaches the right to education, which is immediately suspect because every single private school student is legally entitled to a place in a state school should they want it. But Needle makes other points. He notes that the European Convention on Human Rights requires that people have access to, for example, religious clothing, housing, food. But all of those have taxes applied to them. So if you can tax things which the convention says people should have access to, why not this? Needle also shows that if the argument had any merit at all, surely a more obvious breach of the convention would have been the German church tax. Needle posted a report on a case that was put before the European Court of Human Rights that this was unfair, particularly for spouses who weren't members of the church. And the arguments actually sounded great. I looked at the arguments. I thought just from a moral point of view, yes, I could see how this would be an unfair tax. You know, without, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, but I could, the arguments were compelling, way more compelling than those against VAT on private school fees. But the court still disagreed with the arguments. And why did they disagree with the arguments? On the basis that the plaintiffs were essentially making choices which were landing them with these taxes. They could have made different choices, which would have meant they didn't have to pay those taxes. So in other words, they were choosing to live their life in a way which meant they would due those taxes. Well, the same would apply here. People paying VAT on school fees are choosing to send their children to that particular school when that particular school is available for them and wouldn't charge them even fees, VAT or otherwise. Needle provides a few other interesting cases as well, which you can see in the Twitter thread I've linked in the description if you're interested. We don't need to go over all of them here. Suffice to say, the takeaway from his explanation is the European Court of Human Rights does not interfere in tax policies. People have tried to use it for that. It has failed every single time. But you may think, the senior lawyer cited in the Telegraph, Lord Panic KC, he's famous, knows his stuff. You know, he's the very best. Surely there must be something in the thinking. Well, no, not necessarily, because for a start, when you read the article, it's clear that Panic hasn't actually made these legal arguments himself. It says that other lawyers came up with the arguments and just asked Panic to comment, presumably for a fee. The article doesn't actually tell us what he said exactly, other than, oh, you could make strong arguments about this. Well, anyone can make strong arguments if you're good enough. And as Needle has pointed out, people have made very robust arguments to the European Court of Human Rights in various areas of tax policy. They've still failed. The court just does not appear to consider taxation to be an issue of human rights under the convention. And I just want to make 3 more points for myself, for no other reason than I think it's what makes the entire farce vaguely hilarious. The first is, and this has been raised before, Labour are actually only able to impose VAT on private school fees because of Brexit. They have actually, in fact, the article cites the fact that Labour in the past have tried to do this and have backed away from it. EU law has things to say on VAT, and there are certain protected expenses. So a Labour government in the EU wouldn't have been able to pursue this policy. Now, that doesn't mean to say we've got a Brexit benefit here, because that same Labour government would be bringing in way more in tax revenues from other sources if we were still in the EU, and could remove other tax breaks from private schools, I guess, as well. But nonetheless, with the Telegraph arguing that the policy is unlawful, the irony is, it was unlawful a few years ago. What made it lawful was this Brexit Parliament. The second point is that there's a reason why the Tory press are going at this policy, like a dog with a bone wrapped in bacon. I mean, of all the many Labour policies they must surely hate, this is the one they push more than any other. It just keeps cropping up and up and up and up and up. Why? Because although only 7% of people in the UK go to private school, the figure is significantly over 40% for people who work in the media. And I don't think it'll be much of a stretch to suppose a higher percentage still when you drill down to those who work for the Tory-owned media. So the editors and writers producing these pieces are acting entirely out of self-interest. They're literally just trying to save themselves a few quid by desperately trying to persuade voters it's a bad idea. An entirely selfish use of their platforms. And the third thing is this. So we're getting ready for another major change of political direction in this country. It will be the third one I can remember. You know, I was around when Thatcher came to power, but I was very young. So I remember when Labour came to power in 1997. I remember, of course, when the Conservatives came to power in 2010. And this is going to be the third, major change of government after a long period of a previous government. The Telegraph are not looking forward to it. It's not difficult to imagine there. And yet, of all the ways they could have tried to trip Labour up, to at least hamper them, they've been pushing issues like this which just have no cut through to the public. Because although we'll say 7% of people go to private school and therefore presumably a similar percentage send their kids to private school, there's no suggestion that all of these people are even opposed to the policy. Of the people who pay those school fees, quite a lot of them have been happy to come out and say, well, we should pay VAT on it. It's not fair that we don't. And so only some of those 7% are opposed to this policy. And all of the 93% who don't go or don't send their kids, they're certainly not opposed to it. So the percentage of people who even agree with the Telegraph on this would be actually quite small. They're literally looking at what could easily be the biggest Labour win in history. And their plan to try and take the edge off it is to push stories on like private school fees or transphobia, like issues which even most of those who are quite well off just don't rate as priorities. It's not just the Tories who seem to have lost all sense of political strategy. The client media seem to have lost their edge in the last few years as well, which I think is a good thing. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.